Moving on to section C, and of course we have our two 25-mark questions. And just before we get started with 7 and then later on 8, let's have a look at this. So first one, number 7 is on protectionism, and the number 8 is on globalization. So both the 25-mark questions on the topic of globalization. Now, why am I bringing this up? Since a lot of students do not like the topic of globalization, they under-revise it, and in this scenario, if you maybe have neglected globalization slightly, you are totally screwed. So globalization, I really believe, is a really easy topic to score well on 25-mark questions on, especially if you practice them, you know how to answer the questions. So 100%, I would say globalization has almost as much weighting as your entirety of your government objectives. So all the inflation, all that big topic of inflation, all the rest of the government objectives, all the policies, people really tend to focus on them, but then neglect the other side of the spec, which is the global economy. So the main topic being globalization is 100%. As we can see from exam papers, and this is the reason why we do past papers, to try find the relative weighting, try find what actually comes up in the exam, to revise things that actually come up in the exam instead of just revising from your content. So there's a difference between revising from the exam papers and revising content. So revising content, you're just making sure you can recall things, whereas you have no idea whether that's actually highly weighted, whether that comes up in the exam. And there's some topics which come up a lot, and some topics do not come up a lot. So by doing exam papers, you're making sure you're actively revising the topics, the questions that are regularly assessed. And that is, of course, why we promote doing exam questions so much. Let's get started with the first 25-mark question. So evaluate the likely impact of an increase in protectionism on the global economy. Now, it is currently 2025, 17th of August when I'm recording this. And of course, in the last few months, this is actually, of course, very topical with Donald Trump's tariffs and all of the trade barriers we are seeing recently. You could talk about the concept of deglobalization. And yeah, so of course, the question is on an increase in protectionism, and it gives us, again, a stimulus which is very relevant right now as well on China and US tariff barriers. And the stimulus just talks about the China and US, which of course is very relevant in the current moment as well, but their tariff barriers. And the IMF estimates it's going to reduce global GDP growth by 0.8. And when I read that, the first thing I'm thinking about is a theory of comparative advantage. As remember, the main thing the theory of comparative advantage states is that if countries specialize in a good they have a comparative advantage in, it means global output will increase, and if global output increases, what does that mean? It means global GDP increases. Thus, of course, if global GDP is increasing, it means living standards are improving in every single country. So, since this is an impact question, the way I'm going to think about it is which are the different shareholders in the economy it can impact. So let's think firstly, who are the different shareholders in the economy? So we'll start with, of course, consumers are the first shareholder, then we have firms, then we have households, we have governments, etc., etc. But what I'm going to focus this question on this answer on, is the two big ones, which are consumers and firms. So how is an increase in protectionism going to affect consumers and firms? And how would we show this increase in protectionism on a diagram? And of course, that would be a simple, nice tariff diagram. So of course, price on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis, then supply. And what is supply? Supply is domestic supply, so supply by the producers within that country. And then demand is exactly the same, demand, and of course demand is domestic, so the demand by the consumers within that country. Then of course we would add world supply. And since we're talking about trade barriers, since we're talking about an increase in protectionism, I'm going to add quite a big tariff here just to represent how it is going to affect the economy. So world supply plus tariff. And then also, what else? The other thing I am actually going to label up is this point here. So what does the equilibrium point represent? This is where demand by domestic consumers is met perfectly, is at equilibrium with supply by domestic producers. So what does this mean? This means there is no need for any trade to occur since the demand is satisfied by the supply. Thus, if there's no trade, we can also call this a closed economy, somewhere like North Korea, for example. Okay, so let's get started with the first paragraph, which I'm going to do, of course, on consumers. So my key point for my paragraph is going to be one likely impact of an increase in protectionism on the global economy will be lower living standards for domestic consumers. And I'd use the example of the tariff that Donald Trump set this year in March 2025, where he imposed a 25% tariff on the import of steel. So then I would start my chain of analysis by explaining what protectionism actually is. Since remember, we assume the examiner has no content knowledge and we're being as step-by-step as possible. So what is protectionism? It's where a government tries to protect its domestic economy, and for example, in the example of the US, why has Donald Trump set a 25% tax on aluminium, steel and all them imports? Since Donald Trump is trying to protect its domestic economy, is trying to protect its the US steel and aluminium firms. So the way it gets started with the chain of analysis is just by explaining what protectionism policies and what protectionism actually is. Since remember, we're always assuming to have the most step-by-step chains of analysis, we assume the examiner has no content knowledge, so we develop that step-by-step chain. So I'd actually use that applied example. So I would explain protectionism, which is where governments they attempt to protect domestic industries, and the way they do that is by imposing trade barriers such as tariffs, quotas, any other things on foreign countries and opposing countries. And this is the exact reason why Donald Trump set his 25% steel and aluminium tariffs, and like the things on car imports, car engines, the 25% tariff on those as well. Why? Since Donald Trump is trying to protect the US car and trying to protect the US car industry's employment levels, since of course if US car firms are doing well, if they're making profits and if they're selling goods, the derived demand for labour, the demand for US employment will stay high, and of course that is one of every single country's big macro objectives, to maintain high levels of employment. So then I would go on to explain how protectionism actually affects consumers. So these tariff barriers, what they're going to do for consumers, and of course we can show that on the diagram. When world supply increases from WS to WST, what does this mean? It means prices are increasing for domestic consumers. And why is that? That is of course due to the quantity of imports is decreasing from Q1 to now Q2, Q3. And what does this mean? It means that domestic firms now face less competition by these foreign firms, and with less competition it can drive up prices. And then also the opposite side of the spectrum, where the quantity of imports has decreased from Q1 to Q4 to now Q2 to Q3. What does this mean? It means the quantity of imports has now decreased, and if the quantity of imports now decreased, we can say consumers have less choice also. So consumers are getting a really bad bargain, aren't they? They're getting higher prices and also less choice. And of course the combination of these two are going to lead to reduction in consumer welfare and reduction, more importantly, in consumer living standards. Since why? Let's go back to the theory of comparative advantage. So one of the assumptions we make with comparative advantage is that there's no trade barriers, and of course with protectionism that distorts. That means the theory of comparative advantage is no longer valid. And what do we say the theory of comparative advantage states? It states that if countries specialise in goods they have a comparative advantage in, it means global output will increase, which means global real GDP will increase, which means global living standards improve. Whereas, as you can see, due to us distorting, we're no longer fitting the assumptions of comparative advantage. It means at the end, so it shows that global GDP, well, these countries' GDP is now decreasing since they're not trading, and therefore the countries' living standards are now decreasing. And that is, of course, backed up by the extract, the stimulus, where it mentions that it will reduce global GDP growth by 0.8%. And if you want to explain living standards in a bit more depth, you can mention higher prices. Why? Since with higher prices, it means consumers can no longer afford to demand the goods they want and need, for example, necessities. And therefore, for example, if they can't buy medication, if they can't buy essentials like food, or even luxury goods that they want, this is what we would also call a decrease in living standard. But essentially, that's how I would use my first paragraph. Make sure and remember, use your diagram as much as possible, embed it into your chains of analysis as much as possible, and remember always being step by step with the chain of analysis. But now let's move on to evaluation. Okay, so a great evaluation point here is talking about time frame. So talking about how the effects may differ between the short run versus the long run. As of course, in the short run, we're having these negative effects that consumers are suffering from higher prices and less choice. But you could contrast that by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on the positive effects in the long run. As in the long run, of course, what are the point of these protectionist policies? They are to protect domestic industries, to protect infant industries, and by the government pursuing these protectionist policies, they could be successful in protecting these industries and protecting domestic employment, which of course is a much bigger positive, and which is of course a much more important part of the economy rather than consumers just receiving slightly higher prices. Also, you could mention these domestic firms could adapt, as in the long run, as they're serving more customers, they're producing more output, they could achieve things like economies of scale, exploit those economies of scale, therefore have lower costs. And if they have lower costs, this means they can charge consumers now lower prices. So that's a double positive for the government. It means we are no longer importing, therefore you can think about things like the current account is improving, and then also domestic industries are getting stronger. Thus meaning, like I said, it's a positive, it's a double whammy positive. Okay, and now moving on to the second paragraph, which is of course going to be on firms. So how is an increase in protectionism going to affect firms? Let's have a think about this. And I'm going to use the UK example here. And how does UK relate to protectionism? So the UK stance on protectionism is we champion free trade. So UK firms are net importers of raw materials. Since of course, if you think back to globalization and protectionism itself, one of the main disadvantages of globalization occurring is that countries have now become less diversified. For example, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. 50% of Saudi Arabia's GDP is dependent on oil, and it's in the oil industry. Thus, of course, if, with example, oil is a non-renewable resource, so when oil runs out, it means suddenly 50% of Saudi's real GDP disappears. And it's similar with the UK. Of course, Margaret Thatcher, she closed down the mines, she closed down lots of sectors like that. Why? Because she knew that we could import coal for cheaper. But now what does that lead to? It means that now we do not make any coal, we don't dig for coal ourselves. Thus meaning that if these protectionism policies happen, if these trade barriers are imposed, we are still forced to import these natural resources, meaning that we have to pay the higher prices. So therefore we're dependent on other economies and we're reliant on other economies. Therefore that's why one of the main negatives of globalization, as before globalization, countries were mostly self-sufficient. But now, with of course how the theory of comparative advantage goes, with countries having to specialise, or they should specialise in that one good which have a comparative advantage in, and dedicate as many factors of production to that one country, to that one good or that one service. Since essentially what comparative advantage is trying to do is trying to make every single country a hub, a factory for one specialised good, and therefore we have hundreds of countries which all provide one really specialised good or service, which means when we all trade, it of course leads to better trading, better allocation of resources. But of course, due to the dynamicness of the global economy and due to like tensions between the global economy, it can lead to that being distorted. But anyway, UK firms are net importers of raw material. As like I said, the UK is not self-sufficient. So if the UK sets trade barriers such as a tariff to protect domestic employment, this is of course a trade barrier is going to mark retaliation. So wherever we set a trade barrier on, whichever country we set it on, they will retaliate, usually with a similar tariff, a similar trade barrier. So now, if this opposing country or this country we've set this trade barrier on retaliate, how is that going to affect the cost of our imports? Of course, that is now going to lead to an increased cost of import. Why? Since a tariff is a tax on imports, so now that whatever percentage that tariff is, we're going to have to add that onto the cost of the good. And of course, how do we show an increase in the cost of raw materials for firms? We of course would show this on a SRAS diagram. And what would it look like? So of course, SRAS would shift inwards, so leftward, to SRAS1. Now what are the effects of this, and what do we call this? So of course price level is going to increase from PLE to PL1. And what type of inflation is this? This is of course cost push inflation. And of course, coupled with the cost push inflation, we also have a reduction in real GDP. So overall, the effect on firms is if the UK firm set a tariff and of course use a tariff diagram, incorporate the diagram as much as possible, opposing countries would retaliate, thus increasing the cost of imports, which shifts SRAS to SRS1, which of course is cost push inflation, and it will lead to cost push inflationary pressures on the UK economy. And of course you shouldn't underestimate the real GDP effects, as of course the real GDP is decreasing from YE to Y1, thus also meaning by setting a tariff they're getting negative economic growth, which of course goes against the macroeconomic target of economic growth. And of course, you can link that to many things. You could say this leads to lower living standards. You could say it decreases the level of employment in the UK since there's less goods and services being produced. If there's less goods and services being produced, of course, we need less workers to produce these goods and services, thus decreasing the derived demand for labour. And of course, that would completely go against the intended effect of the UK. So one of the main reasons the UK would set a tariff is to protect their domestic employment, whereas as in reality and as we've proved in the chain of analysis, it could actually decrease the levels of employment. Okay, so moving on to valuation, of course there are several different valuation points you can talk about here. One of them is a bit of a niche. Of course you can talk about the simple ones, or well, not very simple, but the classic ones we've spoke about several times, which are size of tariff. Of course that works quite well, but then also you can talk about how it affects different sectors differently, since of course we said the UK are net importer of raw materials, but some UK firms will of course be able to get their raw materials from inside the UK, whereas some firms such as pharmaceuticals will not be able to get all their raw materials inside the UK. So some firms that use like rare materials or like diamonds, stuff like that. I don't think there's many diamonds in the UK, therefore they're going to be affected the worst. So like I always say, the way to evaluate is to read through your chain of analysis and find any assumptions. First assumption we made is that a country will retaliate. Even before that, we've assumed that UK is going to set a tariff barrier. What did I tell you at the start of this? UK champions free trade, so it's very unlikely they will set a tariff barrier. So that is the one evaluation. But then also, opposing countries retaliate. There's no guarantee that the opposing country will retaliate and there will be a trade war. So you could kind of link that in with the size of the tariff. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the size of the tariff. As if the tariff is relatively small, it is unlikely that the country will start a full-blown trade war, will retaliate with the UK due to this size of the tariff. And then let's move to the next chain. So increased cost of imports. You could say, however, this depends on the time frame, as the UK firms could move away from importing from these countries, which the UK has a trade war, has tariffs imposed on the UK, and they could move to different countries who maybe don't have a trade war, who aren't in a trade war with the UK, thus have no tariffs. And then, of course, again, like I said, this is why we go through the chain of analysis. We see the assumptions we made. Also, when we talk about the SRS shifting to SRAS1, it depends on the degree to which how much SRAS shifts. As SRS shifts this much, it doesn't have much effect on the UK economy. There'll only be a small degree of cost push inflation, thus minimising the negative effects, such as the negative effects on living standards and the negative effects on employment. And of course, you could also say, however, this depends on whether the positive versus the negatives. So it depends on whether the cost plus inflationary pressures are worth that the UK domestic firms, the domestic infant industries, are now growing. So it might be better to survive, basically take those cost push inflationary pressures, but then now it means that our domestic industries are growing. So almost opportunity cost. It is worth the opportunity cost of cost push inflationary pressures to allow our domestic industries to grow. But yeah, that is how I would answer that 25 mark question. Just giving you a few points there. But yeah, that is the end of the number